Well, if you've been paying attention to the sports news at all, you know that the NBA has a ratings problem. There are quite a few reasons why the sport is in a ratings crisis, and I'm not going to go too deep into all of these today. We can save this stuff for another video. However, one thing that even really well-written articles like this one fail to mention is the historical context. So let's dive into the history and see what we can find. You see, we tend to forget about this, but the NBA really has not been a major television sport for all that long. It's actually kind of still the new kid on the block in the American sports scene. I mean, maybe the MLS is a little bit newer, but relatively speaking, the NBA is kind of underdeveloped. In fact, the NBA's glory days might have been kind of a fluke. Well, there's kind of this mistaken understanding among basketball fans that the 1960s were some sort of golden age for the sport. Yeah, I mean, Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell were great, but the truth is that the players that they played against, for the most part, were simply awful. And it's really easy to see that if you take the time to watch old NBA footage. Great players could dominate because the rest of the league was really unskilled and was very slow. And so for the entire decade of the 1960s, there wasn't a single year that every game of the NBA Finals was shown on live television, because it was kind of bad TV. In fact, basketball was seen as such a weak draw that ABC cut away from the end of Game 4 of the 1965 Finals with the Celtics up by 20. Now, unfortunately, it's not really all that easy for me to figure out just what the ratings were for NBA playoff games back in the 1960s. There's really just not a lot of good data out there. However, it is obvious from the way that the networks acted that basketball was not exactly a hot commodity. In fact, it wasn't until 1970 that the NBA Finals were finally shown on television in their entirety. So the famous 1976 Suns-Celtics series really should have turned things around for the NBA. This, of course, was the year of the famous triple overtime game in Game 5. That game is still considered by most to be one of the greatest in the history of the league. These games were really the NBA's equivalent to the 1975 World Series, though most modern fans have forgotten about them. And of course, there were some scenes that the league would rather forget about. Of course, the other big news in the summer of 1976 was the death of the ABA, which meant that players like the fabulous Julius Erving would enter the NBA. Looking back, it's actually hard to see how the NBA screwed this one up, but they did. Now, if you look closely at the 1976 Finals, you'll notice something strange. There were 4 days between Games 1 and 2 of the series. This was apparently due to the series beginning right at the end of the May television ratings sweeps period. Okay, I'm not entirely sure that I understand how sweeps worked in the mid-1970s, but at least I can guess. So it seems that this was a period, the sweeps week that is, in which Nielsen Media Research would send out little booklets to certain households. The households would then fill in by hand what their television viewing habits were. So the end result of all of this study would be the all-important TV rating. That was then used to determine how much money advertisers would pay for ads. So during sweeps, the scripted dramas that TV stations would show usually would have some sort of special twist. There'd be something to keep people watching. And specialty sports, which is what they thought basketball was at the time, were to be avoided at all costs. So let me know down below if I got any of that wrong. The sweeps excuse was also why Game 3 of the 1976 Finals started at 10:30 a.m. in Phoenix, which is probably the most ridiculous starting time ever for a major sports championship game. In hindsight, it's absolutely incredible just how much power the network had over the time the game started. And as crazy as it sounds, it actually got a little bit worse in 1977. So instead of showing the trophy presentation at the end of the 77 Finals, CBS broke away right after the end of the game. The reason was to show a live golf tournament. However, ratings had remained relatively high in 1977. By 1978, however, the Bullets-Supersonics matchup simply didn't prove popular with viewers. So to give you an idea of what the ratings meant, the top 20 TV shows in the 1977-78 television season frequently got a rating over 20. The 9.9 average rating that year's NBA Finals received was far below the cutoff where most shows would get canceled. That's how bad it was. Well, so that brings us to the true dark times of the NBA, to the tape delay era. So the problem here was actually a problem that the NBA caused. The league started the season earlier, starting in 1978, which meant that the finals were scheduled for the last 2 weeks of May, which just so happened to be the ratings sweeps period. And of course, CBS did not want NBA games anywhere near those precious primetime slots. And so it was that numerous NBA Finals games in 1979 were shown on tape delay. That would be 10:30 p.m. Central Time Zone, 11:30 p.m. Eastern and Western Time Zones. This was an embarrassment. Not even Magic Johnson and Larry Bird could save it. The 1980, 1981, and 1982 finals all included numerous games broadcast on tape delay. Believe it or not, that even included Game 6 of the 1980 NBA Finals with Magic Johnson's famous spectacular performance. And so it was that Larry Bird's first finals victory was barely watched by anybody, and whatever audience did show up probably fell asleep before it was over. Predictably, the ratings for those series were horrible. And you know, the NBA really didn't recover from all of this until 1984, when the Lakers and Celtics finally met again in the finals. Now, part of the draw of that series, of course, was that every game was shown live in prime time. It helped, too, that the season was pushed back that year to avoid running into the TV sweeps. Really, a big part of why the Bird-Magic rivalry was so huge was that people could actually watch it on television. The growth of cable television really helped, too. It turns out that people become interested in sports that they can actually watch. Michael Jordan would have always been Michael Jordan, of course, but it certainly helped that he was on WGN, which anybody with cable TV could watch. Okay, so what lesson does all this history teach us about the modern league? In other words, what should the NBA do today to get itself back on track? Well, the biggest key is to remember that the games themselves are the biggest advertising draw for the league. Put the games where fans can easily watch them, and the fans will come naturally. Putting more live games on local television channels would be a brilliant move. Stop treating regular season games as a premium product and treat them instead as advertising. It might also help to eventually move on from ABC and ESPN. Now, one thing that's obvious if you watch a lot of old games from the CBS era is that CBS was really bad at broadcasting basketball. That was true even up until the late 80s. ABC's modern broadcasts really are not much better, and ESPN overall doesn't strike me as being very interested in sports anymore. What we need is a broadcast network that is actually interested in the sport, and then we need to flood the market with as many games as possible. In my opinion, that will send us into the golden era, but what do you think?